Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kacie D'Alessandro, and as been mentioned, I'll be speaking about detailing of reinforced concrete structures and several pedagogical techniques that myself and my co-authors, Matthew Swinty and Eric Musselman, have used in our classes. So first, just to give you an overview, what specifically am I referring to when I talk about detailing? This is, as we all know, it's related to the specifications associated with the placement and layout of reinforcement. But as you can see, with all of the ACI references there, many of our students just see this as a list of rules and regulations. But we want them to see this as more than just a list of rules and regulations. We want them to understand the concepts behind the detailing recommendations of ACI. And so looking at our different pedagogical theories, I just show this. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but just to give you an idea of the different methods that we're using, all fall under the umbrellas of active learning and student-centered learning. And we'll see that many of our approaches, we want to get the students engaged, right? We want to encourage their engagement and also encourage them to have that higher order of thinking. So these are the different pedagogical approaches I'm going to go through. There are a lot of them, so I'm going to try to group them together. And with each one, we're going to see an increase in the complexity of the implementation. So I'll start with some of the easiest forms in order to implement into your classroom, and then get into the ones that may take a little bit more time and effort to implement into your classroom. So first we'll begin with skeleton style notes and reflection opportunities, which we already heard a bit about skeleton style notes and what you can do with those. But this is our simplest approach to active learning. So this allows students to fill in the keywords and concepts during our discussion. Maybe they're completing a diagram, but they're not spending as much time trying to write down every single word that you're saying, but really focusing on the keywords. So you may start out with something that has blanks that need to be filled in, and the students will write those in, again, focusing on keywords and the concepts we want them to get. And when it comes to problem solving, a lot of times it's a framework for that, such that the students still do the problem solving, but you can organize the notes for them. And as mentioned previously in the prior presentation, this has really improved student organization of their notes and helped them study more effectively. I've definitely found that, and I've also found it's helpful for me as an instructor to be able to point them to a specific packet of notes and say, oh, go, refer to this lesson, page 3, and it's there. And they can usually find it very quickly when that happens. The good thing is that in the long run, this actually requires minimal prep time in the future, although it is time consuming in the beginning to create this set of notes. It does lead to minimal future prep time. And what we found as one of the big lessons is that providing less content in the notes is often better. So we can engage the students. We want to keep them active. We want to keep them writing stuff down. So maybe we have a diagram and we have them fill it in, but we don't give them all of the pieces. They're filling in the main points. And so the primary challenges are, again, that it's time consuming to create the useful set of notes. And to make sure that it adapts to what you want to do. And it can potentially mean that you're making a lot of paper copies. So if you can go digital and have students fill them in digitally, that can be helpful for that. Reflection opportunities, these are short breaks to re-engage the students. These are your think, pair, share, discussing the muddiest point. Some of these points have been discussed, I know, in part 1 of these sessions in more detail. But what these do is they help to address the short attention spans that we all have, keeping us on task. And also what I see is it refocuses the attention onto the students, such that, you may be talking about a case and then all of a sudden you want to say, okay, now what do you think, right? And you want to make sure that they're understanding what you're talking about. So again, refocusing the attention onto the students and their learning. So now moving on, we'll look at some case studies and how we can implement these by doing case studies both in the classroom, but also through field work. So first we have case studies presented in the class. And so we found actually 2 ways in which we have done this. And the first is to investigate images. So taking images of, say, a problem. So here we have exposed rebar on top of a parking garage. And so we might show them the image and say, well, how do you think this happened? What are possible long-term effects? And what must we consider to prevent this from happening in new construction? So investigating images is one way to include case studies in the classroom. Another is to discuss scenarios. So maybe you consider both of these, right, as kind of a forensic engineering approach to this. And so you may say, okay, you're an engineer on site going out to inspect what's going to happen, and you happen to notice something, and we want to look at what are the potential problems with what you have noticed by some change in plans that has taken place in the field. And so I give a scenario here of what if, you have put in you've specified 5 number 6 reinforcing bars, but they replace it with 5 number 10 reinforcing bars. And so now you can start to discuss, okay, what does this change in plans, lead to? What can it lead to? Well, you can have potential spacing problems. Maybe you're changing the failure type, moving it into a compression controlled failure. These are all things that you can discuss with the students. And so I actually like to use some of these different scenarios as I guess, big topic review and also an end of term discussion so that you can bring in everything from the term into one discussion. Our next set of case studies is through field work, and this can involve a field trip to a site where you investigate a structure in person with the entire class present, or you lead the students out to investigate structures on their own. In that case, it can be incorporated into a scavenger hunt, and maybe they're identifying the cases on their own, or you're giving them guidance to say, go check out this bridge or this building and see that. So here we have over here some exposed rebar at an on-campus dormitory. And so that's something that the students have actually seen around and they know about, and they can go and investigate it on their own, or you can quickly walk over there. So both of which can be really interesting ways to incorporate a case study into class. And again, you can discuss what could have happened and what are possible long-term effects associated with these. You can turn these into an assignment or even a project and have students share their findings with the class. So some of the main lessons learned and recommendations that we have for case studies are that one thing I've noticed, especially with the scavenger hunts, is that students really begin to see infrastructure in a new way. They see things and they become much more observant. I know many of them have told me when doing scavenger hunts that they have seen things that they never really thought about before. And I think that's really unique in getting them to see infrastructure in a new way. Also, many of these methods, I will say, we have incorporated into smaller classes of about 10 to 20 students. But I believe that case studies can be implemented into large classes with little to no adaptation. It may seem like a lot, but you can bring in a picture or a scenario and share with the class, break them into small groups and they can discuss it, or you can discuss it as an entire class. So you can implement this into various class sizes, we believe. Some of the challenges are really identifying clear cases. You don't want them to be overly complex such that there's too many things. There's multiple things that could be causing problems. And your images need to be clear. You have to be able to access your sites. And when you're sending students out, for instance, for the scavenger hunt or to identify cases on their own, they really have to be given a lot of guidance and prepared to really find these on their own. You will find also that you may be answering a lot more questions when you send them out on these, but I do find that those questions and those discussions that I have with students about those are very educational and eye-opening for the students, and they help me understand their perspective as well. So they can be very good opportunities for both sides to learn. Now we'll look at a few different experiential learning opportunities that we have identified that we've used, again, for teaching detailing. One being field trips, then we look at in-class experiments and projects. And so I'll explain some examples of those. First off, field trips don't have to be extravagant. You don't have to travel really far, but you can go to a local structure or even a local construction site for a field trip. As well, you could go to a research laboratory if it's at your own university or maybe a neighboring university or institute. And a precast plant is also a good place, even though oftentimes pre-stressed concrete isn't introduced in an introductory level reinforced concrete design course. It can be possibly advertisement for future coursework available at the university. But here we have a parking structure. I would take students there because they can see the structure very well. It's not something that's hidden like in a building where you can't really see the structure, but you can see more of how it is constructed, and that helps students understand load paths and also like how things fit together. So that can be helpful for that. And again, you can pull case studies from these field trips as well. The great thing is that they reiterate those concepts in class and give the students real life perspective to what they're learning. In-class experiments provide short-term physical interaction with materials. They can either be used to reiterate concepts that you've already presented or even to introduce concepts. I'm going to show you an example of a development length experiment that can really help students understand this concept. So here we have tie wire that's embedded in 2 mortar blocks. On one side, you can see that it's embedded fully, but on the other side, you can see that it varies. So that distance X, the embedment length, is going to vary in length. And so the idea behind this is to have the students pull on either end, like a tug of war, in order to fail the specimen. And if you attach a load cell, you can measure the force required to fail the specimen, and that'll help students understand this concept of development length a little bit better. And I'm quite certain that if they're doing this experiment, they're really going to remember development length as opposed to just hearing a bunch of code specifications, because they're going to remember their friend who probably slipped on the floor and maybe fell or something from the experiment. Then we have projects, which I think is kind of the most advanced way to incorporate experiential learning opportunities. And this one is kind of looking at a long-term physical interaction with the materials to reiterate concepts. And we have used this to reiterate multiple concepts, so not just detailing, but other things as well. So I'm going to show you this beam fabrication and testing project that we've incorporated. Here are some sample beam designs. We would assign these to students, and we wouldn't necessarily tell them what the expected failure mode is. And in the beginning of the course, when they know nothing about reinforced concrete design, they're looking at it going, okay, this just looks like a lot of lines on the paper. So you're really trying to explain this to them. But over time, they learn about all of these pieces, of course, and they start to see, oh, I'm the one who has the compression controlled failure. Oh, mine doesn't have the stirrups in the right place for shear design. And so they start to see those things, but in the beginning they don't know, but they're just tasked with build this beam. So the students go in, they build their beams. We had them build the formwork and then place the concrete for the beams. And it was probably right around when they were placing concrete that they really started to learn about beam design, and they started to see whose beam was kind of the good design versus the not so good design and not ideal failure types. But then they got to go into the lab and test these beams to failure under faculty supervision. So they gained exposure to research procedures and research equipment. They got to observe cracks and failure mechanism. And then afterwards, they got to analyze all of this data and put all of the pieces together. So in terms of detailing, we had them take a look at the detailing of their beam and look at whether it satisfied ACI specifications or not. And then they also got to propose a redesign. So those who had a not so good failure were able to say, hey, we're going to fix this in this way. We're going to use different rebar. We're going to space it out. We're going to change it up. And those who had a good failure usually made it so that the beam was a bit stronger. But again, getting them to reflect on that experience was a really key aspect to getting them to put all of the pieces together for the project. So some lessons learned associated with these experiential learning opportunities is that all of these opportunities seem to build interest in the topics and improve conceptual understanding among the students. For field trips specifically, we found that local sites really work well and they're very helpful to go to. Experiments and projects are going to require quite a bit of additional time and resources, and projects really do require a lot of significant student guidance. So that's one where you really have to be prepared to answer a lot of questions, to go down to the lab and help the students as they're bending rebar, putting their formwork together. I know we had different milestones set up for the entire semester, and we would go down and inspect, right? So we were inspecting, oh, your formwork is good. You can move on to the next the next phase. So there's a lot of interaction that's going to happen if you incorporate something like that. But in the long run, it proves to be very helpful for the students' learning. And then we have some recommended project adaptations. If you're looking at larger class sizes, again, we had student class sizes from 10 to 20 students, but you can do something similar where you test beams as in-class demonstrations. So this might be laboratory personnel, graduate students, maybe research students building beams, and then the students can go visit the lab to see the beam tests. For a more advanced class, you might have students design beams. In fact, I had students who wanted to go and build and test their redesigned beam. They said, I know there's not enough time, but I wish I could do this. And I said, that would be great, but again, time. So a more advanced class might be able to incorporate 2 beam tests in the duration of a term. Finally, I'll talk about the inverted classroom model or the flipped classroom. All right, so in this model, many of you may have heard of this. It's where the student, kind of the traditional lecture materials moved outside of the classroom and you move problem solving and other activities into the classroom. So for this one, students would watch videos in preparation for all of these activities in class. And it really does allow more time to incorporate all those other things that I just talked about, the active and experiential learning in the classroom. One thing that we have found is that assessment of the inverted course material is really necessary because you want to make sure that the students are participating in that out of class content. So low stakes quizzes have been used with good success in this. So you can have students complete a quiz after watching the video to identify some of the main concepts that you want them to take away and have ready and on hand for the upcoming problem solving session in class. So some lessons learned associated with this is that students are often better prepared to solve problems in class when they have the flipped classroom model. It does improve student understanding. It seems to improve that. And the course organization is essential to successful implementation. So this is from an instructor standpoint, it's really important that you have good organization going into it before you implement this model. So some challenges might be initially getting that organization under control, but also making sure that you create focused and short lecture recordings. Our recommendation is no more than 15 minutes in length for those recordings so that you address again that attention span of the students. And personally, from an instructor standpoint, that's actually difficult for me to do. So that's a challenge for me, is to create those short focused lecture recordings. And then finally, the biggest challenge being that there is just a significant time commitment from the instructor required for initial implementation of this in the classroom. But we have found that preparation time reduces with subsequent offerings, which is helpful. So make those videos generalized. Don't say last class or, on Tuesday when we did that, right? You want to keep it generalized so you can use it over and over again. All right, so a quick comparison. Remember, I presented first some of the least complex methods of skeleton style notes and reflection opportunities, moving into intermediate complexity with the field trips, case studies, and in-class experiments. And then we have some more complex methods of some different style of case studies, projects, and the flipped classroom. So lots of different methods that we've implemented to help with detailing and help students see detailing in a new way and understand those concepts. And different levels of complexity depending on where you're interested in incorporating a new method into your class. So conclusions are essentially that we have used, active and student-centered learning pedagogical methods with good success. We found that the inverted classroom model can help us incorporate these active and student-centered pedagogical approaches more readily into the classroom, and that they appear to enhance the student engagement and their understanding and retention of the concepts of detailing. And finally, here's some recommendations just when you're implementing new methods in your classroom in general. Review the literature, review examples, both good and bad. You can learn from both. And then make sure that for things like project-based learning and the inverted classroom model, you know that there's advanced preparation and planning. It's very important to do those. When you're working with a project, make sure you communicate the significant aspects of a project on the syllabus. You want to make sure the students know what's expected of them so that they are not surprised, right, in the middle of the term that they have a significant out-of-class commitment that is required of them. And then finally, student buy-in of a new approach is essential for both student and the instructor satisfaction at the end of the day. And I found that when I share the pedagogical evidence supporting a new method, that can be helpful. So I think of this as like the reading rainbow approach. Don't take my word for it, right? Take somebody else's, because I'm going to present you with the pedagogical evidence supporting that this is a good thing for you. And I found that some students respond well to that. As well, kind of the same approach is that you can bring in former students and have them share their experiences and give their testimonies for how the different methods have helped them over the time. So finally, acknowledgements. We would just want to thank our respective institutions for all that they've done to help us along the way.